Maybe I'll just get us kicked off here. So to start, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. I know it's I can't believe that we're already into December, and I know your schedules are probably similar to ours in the sense that it's a bit of a shock that we're already into December, and it's going to be a busy end to the year. So I hope everyone's staying safe and looking forward to the holidays. So for starters, I just want to thank our clients for attending our joint presentation here with CDW and PAN. Thank you so much. I think we'll start maybe perhaps with some introductions. And I can certainly start with myself. So for those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet with yet, my name's Rob Henlofsky. I manage and lead the BC branch, specifically the enterprise selling team. I'm new to the role in BC, but certainly not to CDW. I've been with the company in various flavors, whether it be mainland scaler or CDW for over a decade. And most recently managing the Alberta and Prairie team. So I'm certainly hopefully once we get through this COVID thing in the not too distant future, I'm very much looking forward to meeting with some of you in person. But with that, maybe I'll let the PAN folks on the team introduce themselves, and then we'll round out with the additional CDW folks on the call here.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. So my name is Chris Harris. I am a Cortex SE here with Palo Alto Networks. I've been with Palo Alto Networks just over 5 years, focusing on their endpoint product, which historically had been called Traps. My background actually is incident response and forensics. So moving into what we're calling XDR and the incident response and threat hunting pieces kind of in my wheelhouse, and really excited to share that with you guys today.
Okay, I guess I'll go next. So my name is David Hazard. I am a senior security solutions architect here with CDW. Relatively new to the organization. I've been with CDW for about 1.5 years. Prior to joining CDW, I was the manager of architecture and cybersecurity for the city of Surrey. And prior to that, I was responsible for managing the enterprise architecture and cybersecurity programs for Fraser Health. I've got about 14 years of experience in the public sector, and I'm acutely aware of the challenges organizations face with the privacy legislation, particularly when it comes to security solutions.
Thank you, David. So then maybe what we'll do is we'll kick off here for a couple of minutes, just a quick intro on CDW. What we're about. Before I even start there, just to note for folks that are attending, there is a Q&A box there. So certainly you can attach your questions there, and the plan is to review any Q&A following the presentations. So I'll get us kicked off with respect to CDW. So for those of you that aren't aware, we are the leading IT solutions and service provider in Canada, and that incorporates everything from obviously procuring and fulfilling on product, but also providing a bench with respect to professional services, and of course managing that IT environment as well, whether it be security type solutions and or infrastructure. So maybe the next slide, David. Thank you. So this slide kind of just speaks to a little bit of a background. Some of you probably aren't quite as familiar with this with respect to the history of CDW. I often, when I have the discussion with some of my my peers in the finance sector, they're very aware of CDW in the sense that over the tenured history, it's had a very strong and predictable performance from a financial perspective. So if you take a look at it, I'll focus more on the milestones that are relevant for this conversation. But the company was formed in 1984. With respect to CDW Canada, the date that was relevant was a 2003 acquisition of Micro Warehouse, and that really became CDW Canada. I think another notable acquisition would have been in 2006 with the Burpee acquisition, and why that is that really introduced about 1,500 engineer, really added a technical flavor to the company. Before that, CDW was really known as being more of a technology selling company, and this really changed us to be a solutions integrator. And on that theme, and something that's quite personal to myself, in 2019, CDW acquired Scalar, and of course that's something that Scalar was well known for in Canada, providing technical solutions regardless of whether it's infrastructure, security, or cloud. So really complementing that picture in Canada for CDW specifically. And then some other notable, we continue to make acquisitions in the ServiceNow space with Aptris, and of course in the cloud space with IGNW. And just some top level bullets with respect to the nature of the company. It is a sizable international presence, ranked 178 on the Fortune 500. If you take a look at the IT services industry specifically, we rank third, 18 billion net sales 2019 internationally, over 250,000 customers and close to 10,000 co-workers. And notable again, 2,000 plus technical engineers generating 3,500 configurations a day. So truly focusing on providing a complete solution portfolio for our clients. And then maybe just to conclude on Canada specifically, this provides just some of the metrics specific to our environment here in Canada. Notable on this slide is that, and this is an artifact of the acquisition of Scalar as well, is we do have a brick and mortar office, and the claim is to have one at least in every city that the NHL plays hockey, and we also have Victoria, which is great. So again, hopefully, I keep knocking on wood on this, in the not too distant future when life returns somewhat to normal. The nice thing of this is you have a local office that you can work with, both from a sales and operational support perspective, a services perspective, and an architecture perspective. So it lends quite self and complements quite well with the history of CDW. So with that, I will pass it on to David.
Thank you, Rob. All right, well, the first part of this webinar is really focused around FOIPA and cloud services, and we're going to talk about the changes that have been made to cloud services and some of the challenges that still exist in spite of those changes. However, before we get into that, just a little bit of a disclaimer, set expectations. The purpose of this webinar is not to provide advice or guidance on privacy, and it's certainly not a replacement for you as an organization doing a proper privacy impact assessment and threat risk assessment to onboard to these types of security cloud services. It is really intended to provide you with the information about what we're hearing from our clients with the existing challenges, and of course with our Palo Alto partner to review a very cool solution that's cloud services, and definitely from our perspective a good way to achieve both security and FOIPA compliance. So I want to start off this presentation with just identifying one of the key areas that's called out in the legislation and why we're talking about this in the context of security. So Section 30, which talks about the protection of personal information, the one note that's called out there that I want to call out here is that the legislation really urges you as a public sector organization to take reasonable security arrangements against the unauthorized access, collection, use, disposal, blah, blah, blah. Basically, you want to make sure you are taking reasonable security measures. Now, the challenge is, of course, that reasonable security is a constantly moving target, right? As threat actors and even inside actors become much more sophisticated in their attack techniques, organizations and certainly security technology providers need to continuously evolve and improve their cybersecurity controls so that they can prevent and respond to cybersecurity incidents. Now, depending on the framework that you use, you could use ISO, you could use NIST. I've got up here CIS controls. When we look at reasonable security, most organizations would use a framework to help guide where they need the various controls at a certain maturity level. And CIS I use as a good example because it's a nice kind of containerized box or boxes, if you would, for the types of controls that you would need to provide that level of reasonable security. Now, highlighted in red here kind of shows where a lot of these security services, in order to keep pace with the malicious actors and leverage things like machine learning and AI and really benefit from cloud computing and the amount of compute that you need to respond to these sophisticated attacks, many of our security services partners at the request of organizations have moved their security services into the cloud, or components of their security services into the cloud, again, to leverage that cloud compute, to leverage AI, to improve detection and response, prevention and response time. So let's quickly talk about some of the changes to the BC privacy legislation that occurred back in 2019. Now, the first thing I'm going to call out here is Section 30, and we're not talking about a change here, but this is kind of a general statement, and it has, for the most part, been the angst when using cloud services. Certainly hasn't been the only challenge around using cloud services when we talk about the privacy legislation, because of course, privacy legislation covers off a whole lot more than storage and access, but the underlying challenge that most public sector organizations have faced when trying to consume cloud services has to do with the storage and access, which according to the legislation must be in and from Canada. Unless, and again, what I've done is I've highlighted just the bottom there, is if it was disclosed under Section 33.1, which is where the changes in the legislation have actually occurred. So I'm going to move to the next slide there. Okay, so there were really three changes to Section 33.1. One was to the original paragraph. It was more of a tweak than a change, so I'm not going to address it here. But there were two new paragraphs that were added to the legislation to address this notion of being able to, at least on a temporary basis, process personal information outside of Canada, so not necessarily within the bounds of Canada. Okay, the Act basically calls out in paragraph 1 that under the Act, you can temporarily disclose, that is, store and process information outside of the Canadian borders, the Canadian line, assuming the following. Number one is that there's no intentional access or storage other than metadata outside of Canada. So nobody's intentionally accessing it from outside of Canada, and you are not storing personal information other than personal information that is metadata. And number two, that disclosure, if you would, that storage or processing is temporary in nature, meaning it is only being processed for the for the minimum period of time necessary to complete that processing. Okay. Second paragraph of 33.1 actually addresses metadata specifically, and this is kind of important, as we'll see when we start talking about some of the challenges. The metadata itself is that would contain personal information. Again, there is in temporary nature, can be processed outside of Canada according to legislation. However, that metadata does have some parameters around it. The first parameter is that it is generated by an electronic system. So it is not metadata that somebody has manually put in, but that it is generated by the electronic system. And number two, which is I think equally important, that metadata is the intention of it is that it describes an individual's interaction with an electronic system and doesn't describe properties about the individual themselves that are outside of that interaction. Part 3 and part 4, I mean, if it is practical, they ideally would like the information destroyed when it is no longer needed. How practical that is obviously going to depend on the cloud service. And importantly, and this will really speak to your need to ensure that you've got your proper contracts in place, is that you are guaranteeing as an organization or ensuring that the cloud provider that you've chosen prohibits or is prohibited from disclosing or secondarily using the information that's being stored, even if it is in a temporary nature outside of Canada or accessed outside of Canada. So those were the changes to the legislation. And there was a lot of excitement when these changes first came out around enabling organizations, particularly to leverage security services that are provided by the cloud, where, as a security experts, we saw a lot of the information that was going to be going to the cloud would be processed. It would be temporary in nature only. And so when we saw the changes to this legislation, we were all quite excited about it. However, in communication with many of our public sector clients, there are some significant challenges that remain with using cloud services that are not security cloud services that are not based entirely in Canada, so that exist beyond the bounds of the Canadian geography. Most of that actually has to do with Section 33.1. So again, I've got it up on the screen here for you just to take a look at it if you're not familiar with it. And this is where we talk about the temporary nature of processing, the fact that the information is not, there's no intentional access, and that the personal information is kind of wrapped up in metadata. And again, temporary in nature. So here's where some of the challenges arise. And I'm going to call these out. They seem like they're coming at you in reverse order. But again, this is how we've kind of heard this from our clients. So the first challenge for public public sector organizations that we've heard has to do with this temporary access or the limited amount of time for processing. The challenge when it comes to security services is that often the information that could very well be personal information, and an example of that might be, say, a name of a file of an organization. And from my old stomping grounds at the city of Surrey, often files would be named according to address or according to citizen name and what, because their intent is for use internal. However, if that particular file is processed by the cloud in a security service, now that information, which technically is metadata about the file, the properties of the file, are going to be stored in the cloud. Now, the thing is a lot of the services require longer term storage than just quick time processing, which is, maybe a file is detonated in the cloud to determine whether or not it's malware. But the properties associated and the metadata associated with that file do need to persist, and often they persist for up to and beyond 90 days, and for various reasons, which calls out a challenge, because this now we get into this kind of interpretation area where what is temporary processing and what is the necessary period of time? So that openness to interpretation has caused a lot of our clients to say, well, wait a sec, we're not really sure that if we go and use these cloud services outside of Canada, if we are still going to be compliant with the legislation, because temporary access and minimum period of time are slightly ethereal concepts, right? They're open to interpretation depending on the organization and potentially the privacy officer, the security officer, or even the legal officer who is actually reviewing the cloud service and that particular use. The second challenge really comes around this notion of intentional access by an individual. So many security organizations that are now providing client services to address some of the concerns organizations who are consuming these services have around not having the necessary skill sets to be able to do things like active threat hunting or respond to incidents. What they have done is they've crafted as part of their services this notion of somebody on the other side that's part of the security service provider that's actually going and doing these active threat hunting. So they would be actively accessing this information. And again, in many times this information might not actually be available to them. They'd be accessing different information because that possibility exists. And often those individuals are going to be required to access the information to do that response or to do that threat hunting. This is called into question this notion of intentional access. If I am using a cloud service that's based outside of Canada and I'm paying for one of these next generation services where I've got active threat hunting, am I now invalidating my organization's compliance with the legislation? Am I out of compliance because I've done this? Oops, sorry, let me just go back. I went too far. Apologies for that. The second challenge is, third challenge is really with this notion of metadata. And it's really, again, metadata is a term that's, I would say, poorly understood by many people. Metadata basically is data about data, so information about a file, information about, again, an interaction. And so the legislation does say that you can store temporary in nature personal information if it is metadata outside of Canada. The challenge, however, is the definition of metadata, which is actually called out in the second paragraph, and it specifically stipulates that metadata that is allowed to store personal information outside of Canada has to be generated by the electronic system, which often it wouldn't be if somebody has taken an interaction. Again, I'll use that file name as an example. If we've named a file by somebody's name or somebody's address and the system happens to process that, well, that metadata, that property of the file has not been processed, has not been generated by an electronic system. It's actually been generated by a person deliberately. And second, I think more importantly, many of the properties or metadata that's going to be attached or sent to the cloud is actually not necessarily going to be describing an individual's interaction with the system. Certainly a firewall log would, or perhaps somebody's use, if you think of like behavioral analytics, use of a system and various files. But the files themselves, as an example, that would have that particular type of metadata that may be personal information does not actually describe an individual's interaction with an electronic system. It actually describes, in this instance, the file itself or who that file or that information is about. Now, again, we're not saying that that we feel that this is a particular challenge. What we're saying to you is that public sector organizations, our customers, have come and said that because of these 3 areas of uncertainty, they are very leery about leveraging cloud services, security cloud services that are not based exclusively in Canada, because they just don't know whether or not they're going to fly on the right side of the privacy legislation. And most public bodies, and in fact, I'd say all public bodies in BC, they really want to be that good corporate citizen. They want to make sure they're compliant with the privacy legislation. They put a lot of processes in place. At the same time, they want to make sure that they are protecting their organization and the personal information that they have, that they are the custodians of, by using these cloud services. So the two, unfortunately, are they don't mesh. There's a lot of uncertainty and unwillingness or unease about leveraging cloud services that are not based in Canada for security. Okay, so the good news is the security providers have listened. So a lot of CDW's partners are now starting to bring their cloud-based security services to Canada, exclusively in Canada, to meet those data residency requirements. And that's really a great handoff to our partner here, to Chris Harris from Palo Alto, who's here to talk about one of those security solutions that Palo Alto provides that is now in Canada and Canadian based. So with that, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you, if that's all right.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Just 1 second. All right, I should be sharing my screen now. And here we go. Perfect. Thanks for that turnover and the description of the privacy legislation. Definitely much more of an expert in that field than myself, even though we have been working quite extensively with the BC private sector, as well as the Canadian government as a whole, who have similar concerns about data residency. So first and foremost, I just want to say that we are going to be talking about one piece of Palo Alto's infrastructure and products that we offer, which is what we call Cortex, which is under the Secure the Future. This is everything related to detection and response, automation and orchestration, behavioral analytics for both network as well as endpoint and third-party data, and then also threat intelligence. So 1 second, let me move something out of the way here. Now, the good news, as David mentioned, we have been investing quite heavily, especially even over the COVID times here, where we've seen a lot of companies start to pull back investments and doubling down. And we've been talking about bringing this type of thing to Canada for quite some time. And it's actually a reality now. So bringing it home to Canada, we really wanted to be able to do more with core government, Crown Corps, health authorities. We've got many customers using our products from the firewall side, with tweaks and stuff to limit what is submitted to things like our Wildfire in the past. And we wanted to be able to do more. So we've kind of introduced a few of the different product lines that enabled this, which is our data lake, XDR, even Prisma Cloud and Prisma Access, and then our cloud detonation system and threat intel, which is Wildfire. I'll dive deeper into that. We've also started working with a consultant, a privacy consulting firm. They are going through and doing a privacy impact assessment on all of our services. Obviously, we know that everyone that is going to be consuming this will have to do their own PIA, but we wanted to go through this proactively to be able to give that as an example so that you can see the type of data that is available for you to complete those assessments on your own. We also have very robust public privacy data sheets, which can be reached at this link. Or if you just Google privacy data sheets from Palo Alto Networks, they're very easy to find on Google as well. The thing that's not on here is we are SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, and we can provide that as well to our customers to be able to prove that if need be. So with that, on October 7th, we had our first official press release talking about bringing the investments and our cloud services to Canada. This was great news for a lot of our customers. At this point in time, we kind of laid the foundation with our Cortex data lake, which is where we store the information to be processed by the other services. This also enabled Prisma Access, which is our remote access for branch end users. And since that time, basically on November 1st, we officially released the Wildfire Cloud, the detonation, which we'll talk more about in a second, Cortex XDR, as well as we've had Cortex XOR, which is our automation platform for quite some time. So Wildfire, as I mentioned, just a quick high-level overview for anyone who's not familiar. This is where every sample that we see across all of our customers, our firewalls, our endpoint, any interaction with any of our systems gets automatically detonated within Wildfire. We can see what those files are doing. We extract lots of metadata and artifacts from that, and we can start to basically push that threat intelligence to all of our customers in near real time, upwards to about 5 minutes, but with our latest release, pretty much instantaneously. So we want to be able to provide more of these services to our BC counterparts and customers. Like I said, in the past, some customers were leveraging us only to detonate things like portable executables, things where it's very unlikely to have personally identifiable information. But with the introduction of being able to analyze things like documents and scripts and different things, it's very important to have this type of a service in Canada for our customers. Like I mentioned, the Cortex data lake fully residing in Canada now to be able to store the different types of logs coming from the network, coming from Endpoint, coming from cloud and third-party providers, which enables us to provide that Cortex XDR service, which I'm going to be speaking to for most of the presentation. XOR, as I mentioned, our automation platform, it's actually available in different formats. Customers can run this on-premise, which a lot of our Canadian customers have been doing. We can also host it in the cloud. And when we host it in the cloud, if we're hosting it as a SaaS, you have the option of hosting it in an AWS cloud region within Canada. And that's been available for some time now. Not my product line specifically, but Prisma Access, as I mentioned, remote access for mobile users, been very popular during COVID as a lot of our workforces have been moving to work from home scenarios, as well as connecting remote networks and branches. If you have any more questions on Prisma Access, please reach out to CDW. They'll put you in touch with the right person at Palo Alto Networks. And then also Prisma Cloud. So being able to provide security for your SaaS applications. Again, not my product line specifically. If you have additional questions on Prisma Cloud, please reach out to CDW. Now we'll get into the fun stuff. So now that we have that infrastructure to be able to provide these services to our Canadian counterparts that are reliant on Canadian residency, what are some of the problems we're trying to solve with Cortex XDR? Well, first and foremost, this actually really reminds me of the CDW slide that was up earlier, just a little bit different context. As CDW was growing, the attackers were growing too. You can see going back here to 1998, some very simple worms, Trojans and viruses, but over time, this has gotten quite complex. The attackers are getting smarter. They're starting to leverage automation. They're starting to leverage bigger and bigger campaigns to be able to get inside organizations. And then once they do get in, the results of those breaches are much more costly. You can see there's some stats here, right? 150 million records stolen, 147 million records stolen. These are things that hit the news, right? And none of our customers want to be in this position. So we want to be able to start helping them to reduce their risk and likelihood that this would ever happen. Now, as companies are starting to address these issues, they've gone down the path of taking a look at how do I address these by bringing in new products. And there's tons of vendors out there. They all solve small pieces of the puzzle. And what we've been left with is an eye chart like this. So where we have customers who have invested a lot of time and money in a SIM that could be considered their own data lake. Or not even little, quite large actually, once you start funneling all your different applications and your security solutions into that SIM, writing complex correlation rules yourself, it can be quite burdensome. Then you have EDR, which in and of itself is a bit of a data lake where it's collecting all this rich data coming from endpoints to be able to go back and look to see, if there was ever a breach, how did that attacker get in? What did they access? What did they take? Then we look at companies that have been playing in the NTA space, so network traffic analysis and UEBA, two different products that are sort of looking to see from a network perspective and a user perspective, how are these entities changing their behavior over time? And what this has led to is a bunch of different screens, a bunch of different siloed products that are really just creating alerts for our analysts. And generally, these are going to be tier 1 analysts. I was fortunate enough to build a SOC with about 7 to 8 people at our prime. Most of the customers that we deal with here in Canada do not have that. They have small security teams or teams of IT personnel that are doing security on the side. So what happens is not only are they burdened with their day-to-day work, they're also burdened with all these different technologies that they need to keep up and running, as well as triaging these separate alerts. When they go through that point of triage, they're jumping from screen to screen, trying to manually correlate what was happening during that attack. And what usually ends up is they get to the end of the attack or their investigation, and they either don't have enough information to make a conclusive decision on was there a breach, was anything stolen, or they don't know what was taken. They know there was someone in, they know that maybe there's a ransomware attack, and obviously they're trying to recover from that. But lack of visibility in a correlated story really gets to a point where they don't have anywhere to go, right? So they're basically in firefighting mode. So what this leads to, the enemy of the legacy SOC, and again, we don't need to harp on the Security Operations Center, but this is just security teams in general. We generally have too many low fidelity alerts. The investigations are very time consuming, repetitive manual tasks, so completely taking, without automation, going and doing the same thing over and over again can really lead to one of the highest things on here, high analyst turnover, so fatigue of those analysts. Important threats are generally missed. When you read about these bigger breaches in the news, it's not that the security tool didn't raise an alert. It's just that it got missed. It got buried in the other thousands upon thousands of alerts that happened that day. So how can we solve this? This is why we're introducing Cortex XDR. We believe we have a better solution where we can take multiple different product sets. Obviously, we highly recommend our Palo Alto firewalls, the richest source of data that you can provide. That comes from on the network side here. We have our endpoint product, which is our Cortex XDR agent, which provides prevention as well as data collection for the Cortex data lake. Cloud applications from Palo Alto, so Prisma Access and VM series firewalls, and numerous different third-party data. And this is growing each and every release, the type of data that we can bring in. We're currently bringing in third-party firewall logs, so Checkpoint, Cisco, Fortinet, etc. We're bringing in authentication logs from Windows Active Directory, Azure AD. We can bring in Ping ID, Okta, and Google Cloud logs as well, and that's going to continue to grow. From a third party, we can also bring in any other alert source. It just would need to be mapped. Again, a very easy process to do, but we can bring in any other alert source over Ceph and Syslog as well. And then we layer on top of all of that data, Cortex XDR. This is the brains behind everything. So we're going to be leveraging threat intelligence from autofocus and VirusTotal can be tied in. Wildfire is out of the box integrated with this. Canadian XDR instances by default use the Canadian Wildfire to be able to keep that service all in Canada. So with Cortex XDR, we're taking those silos that we looked at initially, and we're breaking those down into a single product. So we provide endpoint protection, everything that you would expect to be, providing protections against ransomware, viruses, Trojans, being able to give you control over things like mass media and disk encryption, the stuff that you're traditionally used to with endpoint protection. We're also being able to leverage the endpoint detection and response. There's lots of companies out there that came from that pedigree of collecting data and letting analysts go search for it. We're taking that data and we're doing correlation on top of that, stitching that with all the other alert sources. Network detection and response and UBA. So not only can we do this from the network side, we're doing this from the endpoint side, which is very, very unique to anybody else in the market. Again, taking those silos, bringing them into a single location for analysts to be able to effectively triage and manage their alerts. Now, the concept of XDR, we came out with it about 2.5 years ago, actually, before anybody else, very similar to the story about next generation firewall. Initially, when we came out with it, no one really knew what it was. Everyone was like, hey, what are you talking about with XDR? We believe this is detection response across all of the different infrastructure that you have. And we believe that this is really resonating in the industry. So imitation is its serious form of flattery. Every vendor out there is starting to come out with an XDR product. And we're just happy to say we were here first. And I think we're doing it the best. So, and to that point, one of the pieces up here, Josh Zelonis, who was pretty much the creator of the Forrester Wave for endpoint detection and response and wrote that genre, he actually joined us as a field CTO and evangelist because he believes in what we're doing from an XDR perspective and that we're doing it the right way. So very happy to have him on board as well. So what are our key differentiators? First of all, we have always been and always will be best-in-class prevention, providing multiple methods of prevention, which I'll show on the next slide here, but complete prevention against malware. Everyone talks about about ransomware. Ransomware is just malware with a destructive end. We have numerous different ways to stop everything from Trojans, banking Trojans, keyloggers, ransomware, all that kind of stuff is prevented. We have superior exploit prevention. This was our bread and butter since we acquired the initial product, which was Cyvera, almost 6 or 7 years ago now. right? Exploit prevention without having to custom tune a bunch of policies, just out of the box prevention. Uncover and stop complex attacks. Many attacks these days aren't using malware. They're using binaries and scripts that either exist on that endpoint or are pulled down and brought into memory. So leveraging behavioral threat protection to be able to stop these seemingly benign activities, but when you put them together, actually are an attack. I'm not going to spend too much time here. One thing I want to point out is pretty much all of our protection is available offline. So whether you're connected to the cloud, offline, it doesn't matter. We have all of these baked in. The only piece that is required is the lookup to Wildfire. And if that isn't available, we still have all these other local analysis to be able to say, hey, if I've never seen this file before, is it likely good and likely bad? Very, very strong protection. Our customers get this out of the box. We generally recommend default policies. You don't need to go in and customize this for your environment. Default policies work on everything from domain controllers, SQL servers, regular workstations, Linux, Mac. We cover it all. And many different flavors in between. As I mentioned, we have all the standard things that you'd be typically looking for AV replacement, scheduled and on-demand scanning, cross-platform protection, so you don't need 3 different AVs to cover the different types of systems that you have, device control, disk encryption management, and host firewall, right? So very, very robust protection capabilities coming from our XDR agent. The next piece is analytics. As I mentioned, very unique from an endpoint perspective. There's lots of vendors doing it on the network, but what happens when you discover something on the network is you need to know why that endpoint is causing that behavior. Having that visibility to be able to stitch from network activity directly to the endpoint activity automatically without doing any manual correlation really speeds up analysis. So full visibility to detect complex threats. Patented behavioral analytics technology. And we run these across multiple different detectors. I believe there's over 30 now, again, on different data sets, just a very robust, and everything is documented online in our analytics reference guide. So you can fully see what detectors we're running. Compare that to some other vendors that you're looking at potentially. You'll be very impressed, I believe. Also, industry-leading attack coverage. All of our detectors are mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And if that's not something that you're super familiar with, I highly recommend reading about MITRE ATT&CK. They basically gone and looked at all the large scale threat actors out there and took pieces of that of how does an attacker get in? What do they do once they're in? What are they looking for? What commands do they run? What tools do they use? And how do they get data out? And then basically map that across all the different product sets out there. So we align our detections to the MITRE ATT&CK techniques and tactics that are there. So what does this look like? We're basically collecting that network, endpoint, and cloud data, as well as third-party data, and basically understanding what the current behavior of this asset is, and continually matching that back to a time profile of that entity, a peer profile. So not only what this machine is doing, but what is its peers doing? So even if a machine was compromised from day one, we can identify anomalies based off of peer profiles. And then also entity profile. So we give this an entity profile of, this is a workstation, this is a admin user, this is a server, right? So we start to understand what the typical behavior of those entities are. This is really handy for identifying things that aren't malware-based, but insider threats, data exfiltration, privilege abuse, or compromised credentials where now an attacker is on that system and doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. Also, we can do this, like I said, on network traffic analysis. We have the firewalls deployed in many of these infrastructures. You don't need to deploy a third-party infrastructure. If you don't have a firewall in the right place, we can take a tap port just like those other NTA vendors do as well. We also have something called Pathfinder. This is a dissolvable agent that gets deployed on the fly. Maybe you don't have the XDR agent deployed everywhere. We can deploy, when we detect an anomaly from the network side, automatically deploy this agent and start getting real-time collection. Right? It's almost like having EDR on demand, right? So very, very powerful there. We give you the ability to threat hunt on that network data as well. We can create behavioral indicators of compromise based off of network data as well as endpoint data. And it's just seamless cloud native deployment. You don't need to set up any new infrastructure other than what you have. As customers are moving their firewalls into more zero trust architectures, this is very, very helpful. But as I mentioned, we can just take a tap port or span port to get additional visibility as well. Next key differentiator is we want to be able to cut investigation and response times. So one of the key things is we talked about creating excess alerts. we're going to create alerts as well, but we intelligently group those into incidents. We want analysts looking at correlated incidents rather than just raw alerts. We want to be able to give full visibility into the data across all the different data sets, as well as do what we call automated root cause analysis. This is part of our causality chain. We're going to show the analyst what process do we believe caused this chain of events, as well as show the rest of the chain of events in every aspect of that, registry modifications, file activity, things, all of that nature that you'd expect from an EDR tool. So this is what the analyst would see. They have their top incidents. When they click in here, they're going to have all of their alerts and insights in a single location with multiple PCs. So this is one single attack that occurred over multiple machines, and we're giving the information to the analyst with a couple clicks, right? So being able to provide high-level status of all incidents from a unified dashboard, you can create your own custom dashboard and reports, and giving that full picture to the analyst. Again, showing what that looks like from a process perspective. This isn't just a process tree. This is what we call our causality chain. So in this case, the root cause was chrome.exe. The user clicked on a phishing URL in an email. It downloaded a zip file. That zip file executed a script, which called PowerShell, and then attempted a C2 connection. Giving that entire chain without having to piece it together manually really speeds things up and understands what was going on at that time for that user. Again, I mentioned the MITRE attack tagging. We're trying to do this for all of our alerts to be able to tie this back to the MITRE attack. Again, very, very helpful for those both blue teams understanding, where do your product sets align with the MITRE attack framework. We did very well in the MITRE attack evaluation as well. No one beat us. We had the highest coverage for their scenario. So very, very proud of that. And there should be a new one coming out in the next few months as well. So excited for that. We did really well in the first two. Not last, but one of the last pieces is when there is an event, one of the key things to be able to do is respond. So giving that single infrastructure to be able to respond to attacks across single or multiple hosts is imperative to be able to stop the bleeding per se. So we give the ability to quarantine and isolate hosts at the endpoint level. We can also interact with what we call dynamic block lists from the firewall perspective. So being able to add on the fly from a security perspective. We directly connect to that machine to be able to do a live response. Again, very robust live response, which I'll show here in a second. And that exists on all three, Windows, Mac, and Linux, which is very unique to our competitors out there. And then last but not least, we do have open APIs. So we have XOR from an automation and orchestration, but our APIs are open to any product to be able to orchestrate and automate if required. We do believe that XOR is the best in the market. Also vendor agnostic as well. So what does Live Terminal look like? So when you have an incident, you connect to a PC, you're basically given a full task manager access. You can right click on any of these processes, you can terminate them, you can suspend them in memory, you can download that binary, you can interact with the file system, you can download, upload files. All of this is controlled with very strict role-based access control. Everything is audited. You can even disable it for certain systems if there's a requirement for that. The next is going to be command line access and PowerShell access. These are full-featured command shell and PowerShell. You are not limited to learning new commands. You can see ipconfig here. This is a full NT authority system access to that system. So almost at the end of here, with all this data that's collected, what good would it be if we didn't allow you to search it? So with our data set, we've done a few things. One, we want to be able to give our threat hunters, people who have the time to go, and we obviously want all of our customers to get to the point where they've freed up their time with all the manual investigations to be able to do things like threat hunting. We can create powerful queries on this data to look for file activity, process activity, without having to learn a brand new query language. We've got multiple out-of-the-box detections. We call those behavioral indicators of compromise, which you can pivot off of as well. You can create custom rules for custom detections for your organization. And not only that, you can actually pivot those into preventions on the endpoint as well. So you can create custom preventions. We can tie this into threat intel sources like VirusTotal and Autofocus from Palo Alto Networks, and be able to do IOC searching as well. So IOCs are those singular IPs, hashes, file names, etc. So we can bring those in and be able to automatically search for those over time. The next thing that we added is kind of moving towards opening up our infrastructure and our database schema to the world. So we've created a language we call XQL, which allows you to basically answer any question you want based off the data we've collected. This is on our data, our firewall data, as well as we're starting to open this query data sets up to the third-party data that we're bringing in as well. So being able to search and filter, create statistics, do deduping, summing, changing and editing fields, doing JSON extractions. This is a very, very powerful language. If you've used tools like Splunk or Elastic, this will be very easy, or any just SQL, it'll be very easy for you to pick up. We've got very robust documentation on this. This is just a couple examples, right? So being able to search for, on the XDR data, looking for long DNS names, right? And being able to graph that distinct long DNS queries. On the bottom, we're looking for network activity. I have an example here where I created one where I'm searching on network stories, filtering for any internal system that's connecting to 8.8.8.8. And I wanted to know the top 10 systems that did that. So I can graph those either in a table or create a graph, which can be used in dashboards and reports. So again, opening up all the data that we're collecting to be able to provide that to the end user, right? This is going above and beyond the prevention, above and beyond the investigation and response, but really just opening things up. As you start bringing in more data sources, this is going to be more and more important to be able to provide a single location to be able to do all of those different activities in one place. To sum things up, this is something that we're continually investing in. I don't have a slide here per se, but every quarter, every couple months, we're adding new features. We just added vulnerability assessment. So for your Windows and Windows and Linux systems, Linux, we're taking a look at the applications and mapping those to known vulnerabilities. For Windows, we're taking a look at host level patches and OS level vulnerabilities and matching those to say, hey, these CVEs exist. We've created new dashboards for that. So we're continually adding to the product to make the value to our customers much more greater. The sum things up, we want to reduce the risk of a data breach for sure. We want to be able to stop things earlier in that cycle. Obviously, we would like to be pre-execution before anything ever runs, but nothing's 100%, right? That's why we want to have these robust analytics detections. We want to have this robust response actions as well to be able to respond as quickly as possible in the event that you need to. Increase SecOps efficiency. So we've been known, we did some analysis of our customers, and they've said that we've kind of reduced the alerts 50x with alert grouping. So no longer having to look at individual alerts where a single incident could have anywhere from 2 to 3 alerts up to 50 alerts, depending on it. If I let ransomware run and turn off all the protection capabilities, I can literally have 50 different preventions that would have triggered or alerts from that single system. Obviously, with the preventions turned on, there's one. We have local analysis and it stops it there, or Wildfire stops it there. But like I mentioned, we want to be able to prove out that we have multiple ways to prevent things, not just the one-hit wonder of something like local analysis or Wildfire. Last but not least, this is something that's typically a hot topic, is lowering the total cost of ownership. So maximizing the investments. This generally resonates much higher with our Palo Alto firewall customers, but even when we just look at Endpoint itself, if you look at some of our competitors, can they check these boxes? Maybe, but you typically need 3 or 4 different products from them to be able to do it. That increases what you need to operate, the different systems you need to go into when there is an event, going to multiple different consoles to close out a single alert. We give you all of this, all those different siloed tools and technologies in a best of breed format for each in a single tool, right? Drastically reduces the total cost of ownership by 44%. Another piece to this is all those different methods that I talked about are on out of the box. So the operational side of it, so being able to turn on those protections, they're already on by default. You don't need to create a bunch of custom policies. So just operating the tool becomes much more efficient. And with that, I just want to thank you, and we'll turn it back over to David. I'll stop sharing here.
Well, maybe while we wait for David to come online, again, just want to thank all our public sector clients in BC for attending, and specifically want to thank our partner in Palo Alto and Chris speaking to your solutions and specifically to the recent investments that you've made in Canada. and how that can extend the detection and response specifically for our client environments. And
sorry,
of note,
Rob, I am. Can you hear me? I am still here. I was talking because I'm connected to two sides, and I was apparently muted. So my apologies for that.
Oh, great. Great.
I could hear everything everybody was saying. So if we want to throw the share back over to me there, and I will continue because we do have the question and answer session next. Okay, so we wanted to take this opportunity to allow the folks on the call here to ask some questions. We did have some that were sent to us in advance, so I'm just going to throw them up on the screen, and then we can go about answering them. And if there are any other additional questions, you guys can just post them. I don't know if I'll be able to actually see the questions on my side. So Robert, if you or Rob, if you can see the questions, if you could read them out as they come in. But I'm gonna start with this first question here. And the first question that came in prior was, are the ISO standards adequate for assessing and managing cloud privacy and security risks? The short answer to this is no. The more longer answer is there are two parts of the ISO 27000 series that can be leveraged in terms of assisting with your evaluation of compliance and managing those risks. One is ISO 27017, which is the Code of Practice for Information Security Controls, which is based on 27002. And then the second is the Code of 27018, which is the Code of Practice for Personally Identifiable Information in Public Clouds. You can also use another framework I'm a big fan of, which is the Cybersecurity Alliance's STAR registration. So what you can do is you can certainly leverage the ISO standards, STAR registration, third-party attestations of your cloud providers. That's going to provide you the information to help to assess the security of those cloud security providers, as well as their compliance with various macro privacy legislations like the Canadian privacy legislation. What it won't do, though, is absolve you from your responsibility to do the proper threat and risk assessment and privacy impact assessment. And one thing I would encourage you to remember is that with everything with cloud, there is a shared responsibility model that you need to make sure that you are still accounting for when you're doing your privacy risk assessments and your threat and risk assessments. And at the end of the day, the vast majority of the challenges that you're going to have in terms of ensuring compliance with privacy is actually going to be internal processes and policies rather than the security controls themselves. The security controls that an organization is attested against are certainly going to help because it's going to give you that confidence that they have been third-party audited for these cybersecurity controls. But again, shared responsibility model, and you still have the obligation to complete the threat and risk assessment and the privacy impact assessment. Okay. I'm going to throw the second question up there. It says, the legislation does allow for the processing of information for a limited period of time. Please provide examples where this may increase the scope of service offerings within the cloud space. Generally speaking, without addressing those concerns that we heard earlier that we're hearing from our public sector clients, you should be able to start leveraging some of the cloud services that are doing temporary, what we call bursting out to the cloud for processing. That being said, there are those challenges that may still exist with your organization, as do exist with some of the other public sector organizations that we have spoken to, in using cloud-based services that are not based exclusively in Canada. And again, just a little prop for our security partners like Palo Alto. They have heard our customers loud and clear on this and are beginning to invest, and in Palo Alto's case have already invested and are pretty much fully there with Canadian-based cloud security services. Okay, this one is, I think, more for Chris, but Chris, I can support as well if you need to, is how does Cortex interact/compare with Microsoft Sentinel?
Yeah, so first and foremost, even when we have one-on-one conversations with customers, we try not to get into necessarily a feature comparison, because as we are innovating every single day and every quarter we're putting out new products, I don't want to say something incorrect about Microsoft Sentinel, but what I can say is generally Microsoft Sentinel is considered more in the SIM space, right? It does more than just a typical SIM, but it's collecting data and it's running some things on that data. Versus the product suite that Microsoft has, which is ATP, right? So multiple different products addressing different security aspects of cloud, endpoint, and a few different other things. Sentinel is one of those products. I think where we differentiate, and we can interact, we can send alerts to Microsoft Sentinel, just like we can send alerts to any SIM out there. We're not trying to be a SIM per se, even though we can address many SIM use cases for a lot of our customers. And as we move forward in the future, I think we'll be able to address many more going forward. But where Cortex XDR comes in is we're really that one-stop shop for our product line, right? Endpoint, network, as well as third-party, automatically doing that correlation. When we think about UEBA, Microsoft Sentinel does have some user behavior analytics, generally focused more on the authentication piece of it. Again, they're probably innovating there as well on their side. We have over 30 different detectors, everything from user interaction, authentication from those AD logs that we're getting, large uploads, the things that generally the NTA providers are looking for, so failed connections, port scans, right? I think we just have many, many different offerings within a single solution with one single product, rather than piecing together multiple products, even from Microsoft by themselves. You can add to that, David, if you wish.
The only thing I would say is that when you're looking at Microsoft Sentinel, and I think Chris, you kind of already highlighted that, is that it in of itself is intended to be a SIM in the cloud, and Cortex is certainly not a replacement for a SIM. But Sentinel does not do what Cortex does. To Chris's point, there are other Microsoft products you need in order to achieve a similar, though not the same, effect. The one thing I would like to point out, though, and Chris, you know I'm a big fan of the Cortex XOR, which I know is not the topic here, but one of the best ways that the two can work together when managing an incident is actually leveraging the Cortex XOR, which is the security automation and orchestration platform. It works seamlessly with Microsoft Sentinel, so it's got a lot of pre-built plugins, a lot of pre-built templates. It also works seamlessly with Cortex XDR. So from an interaction perspective, you certainly can natively integrate, but using that third party, the security orchestration and automation engine that is Cortex XOR, is really the way to achieve that synergy between the two products, in my opinion.
Excellent. You're 100% correct there.
Rob, can you see if there are any other questions that have come up?
Yeah, I'll let Robert confirm, but from what I'm seeing, I don't have questions here in the Q&A box.
I don't see any questions.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. Well, then let's wrap up. So I just want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. I hope that you found the information useful. I hope you enjoyed the demonstration slide overview of Cortex XDR. If you have questions specifically about Cortex XDR, please reach out to one of your CDW representatives. You can also reach out to me directly if you like. If you have some questions and would like to explore Cortex XDR and how it can help you both with your security operations, but while also maintaining your privacy compliance. Also, CDW does offer a range of security services, everything from professional service implementations and sales of security technology, but also risk advisory services. And one of those risk advisory services that we do provide is assisting organizations with writing or drafting privacy impact assessments and threat and risk assessments. So if you happen to be an organization that is heavily taxed and want to start consuming some of these services, and you don't necessarily have the bandwidth and need somebody to assist you with just basically putting pen to paper for privacy impact assessments and security risk assessments, please also reach out as well. We do have those services available to our clients. Rob, over to you.
I think you said it perfect, David. So again, I just want to thank again our clients in the public sector from BC attending. I hope you found the information with respect to the legislation useful, and thank you to our partner in Pan and Chris providing clarity with respect to your product offering and more importantly, your recent investments in the Canadian market, which is exciting given this audience. And just to reiterate, if there's any questions, please follow up with David and Chris, and we'd be more than happy to have a follow-up conversation.